A tropical island paradise, one where you're about to have the vacation and adventure of a lifetime. It's a universal rite of passage for so many young people from around the world who head off eager to explore different climates, cultures, and food while meeting new people and making connections that last a lifetime. Southeast Asia and its thousands of surrounding islands are a popular destination for many tourists looking to soak up the sun, especially young travelers without a care in the world except having fun. But not everyone who embarks on an exotic getaway comes back with happy memories. Some never come back at all. And for two excited young visitors from the United Kingdom who ventured to an isolated island in Thailand, that was their fate, and this is their story. Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 18 of the Darklivity podcast. I'm your host, Kimbyr, and I'm here with my co-host, my best friend, my fiance, and soon-to-be father of our child, Jonathan.
Hi. Darklivity. It's the dark downward slope into the degradation of the human mind and the consequences that such darkness brings to light. And today's case is one of the darkest ones we've done to date.
It really is. So brace yourself. This is a very sad and scary case.
But before we begin, don't forget to subscribe, hit that notification bell so you don't miss out just in case we decide to post on a different day besides Monday.
As I alluded to in our intro, we're going to be talking about a vacation gone terribly wrong. Our story today takes place in Thailand, and as far as I can recall, I've never researched or talked about a case from Thailand before. However, a lot of members of my family live in Thailand. My uncle actually married a Thai woman, so I have tons of Thai aunts, uncles, and cousins, but I have still not gotten the opportunity to go visit. Because frankly, I'm scared to go that far from home, especially after doing cases like this one. So even though I have to say that Thailand itself is an incredibly beautiful country, and that is, of course, what draws so many people there every year, I'm just scared to go too far from home. Let me know if you've ever been there or you're currently living there. But in order to understand everything in this case, we first have to take you out of the United States and Thailand altogether and introduce you to two different people who were strangers to one another before they both made their way to a small island in Thailand.
The first person we'll introduce you to is David William Miller. David was born on May 21st, 1990 in the parish of Trinity, Jersey, where he would grow up.
And when he says Jersey, he doesn't mean New Jersey here in the U.S.
This Jersey is the largest of Great Britain's Channel Islands. It's just off the coast of northwest France, a self-governing area not part of the British Crown. Around 100,000 people call the 46-square-mile island home, where spectacular cliffs and picturesque beaches attract thousands of tourists annually. This is where David was raised by his parents Ian and Sue and grew up with his brother Michael. Throughout his childhood and as he grew into a young adult, David's artistic and creative talent made him naturally bright, curious, intelligent, and conscientious. He was known as Dangerous Dave, or Disco Dave to his friends. David attended Victoria College in the Jersey capital of St. Helier, where his teachers and friends could tell that his outgoing personality and enthusiastic approach to life would see him achieve big things. After finishing high school in 2008, David enrolled at the University of Leeds, north of British mainland. He graduated with a degree in civil and structural engineering in June 2014, not long after beginning his internship back in Jersey with a mining firm called Consolidated Minerals. David was allowed to venture to the opposite side of the world and continue his career by doing a 6-week work placement with the same company in Australia.
This opportunity meant that he would temporarily have to be away from his long-term girlfriend, Jessie Howarth. But it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and of course, Jessie understood, and she didn't want David to miss out. So on July 18th, 2014, David left Jersey for his new home, temporarily, in Australia.
But he only planned on being away for a few months because he wanted to get straight into his master's degree that same year back in Leeds. But he was also excited when he got another opportunity after he finished in Australia to add a few weeks of travel to the end of his trip before heading back home. And the fact that it's a usual stopover for international flights out of the country to the UK, David decided it was a perfect place for a brief vacation before returning to Leeds and then putting all that work into his postgrad studies. His close friend Chris Ware and his brother James joined him in Asia. Like David, Chris and James are also from Jersey and have known each other since childhood. In late August, David and his friends arrived in Thailand. They were planning on staying until September 16th and then spending a couple more weeks exploring other parts of Southeast Asia before they went home. But for now, they were looking forward to a few weeks of relaxation, socialization, and partying.
While David had been finishing up his work placement in Australia, the other person we're going to be introducing you to was living in Britain, 23-year-old Hannah Victoria Witheridge. She was eagerly awaiting her own vacation to Southeast Asia. Hannah was born on October 5th, 1990. Her parents, Tony and Sue, married in October of 1976 and raised their children in Norfolk's seaside resort village of Hemsby, where Hannah grew up alongside her sisters Tanya and Laura and brother Paul. From a young age, Hannah developed a lifelong interest in horseback riding and show jumping, and she and her sisters took equestrian lessons together at the Croft Farm Riding Center in Philby, which was not far from where the family lived. Hannah also attended the Langley School and City College in nearby Norwich. Her teachers knew her as being a perpetually smiley and happy young woman with a quiet and gentle nature about her, who was at the same time very grounded. Hannah stood out as someone who really wanted to do well. She put 110% effort into everything she did, and she was intelligent and loving, the sort of person who cared about others' well-being. She had a naturally caring disposition, which made sense when you consider that after graduating, she went on to obtain a bachelor's degree in education from the University of East Anglia in 2012, graduating with honors. She was also very beautiful with striking blue eyes and light blonde hair. She actually reminds me of a mixture of a modern-day Marilyn Monroe mixed with a Holly Madison. The bubbly student loved hanging out with her large circle of friends, going out on the town, but she also had a laid-back side, and she was known for her cooking and being a fantastic hostess for all of her university friends. She would hold dinner parties where she lived with her roommate, Lucy Dunkley, and the door to Hannah's place was always open. Anyone could drop by for a coffee, glass of wine, a chat, and a laugh. Lucy described her friend as irreplaceable and always treasured the time that she spent with Hannah. During her undergraduate studies, Hannah also worked for 8 months at a magazine publishing company that actually published Bride magazine, and she would stage wedding expos, and her coworkers and bosses knew that her solid work ethic and desire to always do her best would make her succeed, and they were sorry when she eventually had to leave the company.
Hannah finished her job with the magazine company because she was returning to study the following year, enrolling in master's degree program in speech and language therapy at the University of Essex. She moved 80 miles away to Colchester. Now, if you didn't know, Colchester is famous for being Britain's first Roman city and its thriving student population. So during Hannah's course, she joined her fellow speech and language therapy students in raising money for the charity BBC Children in Need. She knew that one day she wanted to work with children herself. And in January 2014, she had just finished her first clinical placement, and she was proud of her efforts. She hoped she was making a difference in the lives of the families she helped.
By mid-2014, Hannah was done with her first year of her master's degree. She was ready for a break to do a mental reset from her postgraduate studies before starting her second year. And initially, she was considering seeing more of Europe or even going to Australia, and her family was supportive of this idea. But at the last minute, there was a change of plans. Hannah decided to book tickets to Thailand with 3 of her closest friends. And even though Hannah's family was supportive of her desire to explore new places and experience new things, they were actually very reluctant for her to go to Thailand specifically.
Hannah had already taken short trips to Europe with her friends, but Southeast Asia seemed so far away, and her family was really worried about that. Especially because her older sister Laura had been very ill and battling a condition called trigeminal neuralgia, which causes severe facial pain. She underwent more than 50 procedures to try to alleviate the symptoms. She even had surgery in 2011, but it ended up leading to even more complications like meningitis, spinal fluid leakage, sepsis, and the buildup of fluid on her brain. Out of her 2 sisters, Laura was Hannah's best friend. They were very close, and they were only about 2 years apart, so the family knew having Hannah away when Laura was in such bad condition made them even more worrisome.
That sounds so brutal because I've actually suffered from spinal fluid leakage myself and was bedridden for over 3 months. As a whole other story, but I cannot even imagine having to go through all of that. And of course, Hannah understood her family's concerns, especially given her age. She was just 23. and the fact that she was a woman traveling to a place where she'd never been before and she didn't even know the language. However, she was intelligent, responsible, and knew not to take any risks that would put her in danger. Plus, she was going to be there with her 3 friends, and there was safety in numbers. They would always stick together. She promised her family that she would be just fine. But her family was hoping that she would change her mind and go somewhere else. So they were not happy when Hannah told them she was going ahead with her Thai trip. But she was an adult, and there was nothing they could do about it. Hannah reassured her loved ones that she would be in constant contact to alleviate their worries. Giddy with anticipation at what adventures awaited them, Hannah and her friends departed the UK for their trip of a lifetime. They arrived at the end of August, around the 25th, and this is the exact same time that David and his friends made it to Thailand as well.
So if you haven't been to Thailand or don't know much about it, 25 million people from around the world visit the country every year, including 800,000 people from Britain alone. Among its most popular tourist destinations is the tiny island of Koh Tao. It's 250 miles from Bangkok in the country's south, situated in the Gulf of Thailand to the west of the mainland, and one of the 3 islands of Chumphon archipelago. As Koh Tao is relatively isolated from the mainland, there are no flights, and you can only access this island by a 2-hour boat ride.
And it is a very beautiful island. But as John explained, it's very isolated and it's small. It's only 8 square miles, but it looks exactly like what you would see in a travel brochure. It's the place where you can imagine just forgetting all of your stress, where your troubles and your cares feel a world away from the pressures of normal life. A place where you can truly unwind and take in the sparkling water, the pretty blue sky, the lush green jungle nestled on hills overlooking the pristine white beaches. Koh Tao is actually translated to Turtle Island in English. It's one of the world's top snorkeling and scuba diving destinations, and it's known to have tons of sea turtles when it was first inhabited. It's a place where tourists flock to explore the crystal clear waters and are amazed by the variety of colorful aquatic sea life and stunning coral reefs. I was a certified scuba diver for years, and this would definitely attract me. I just love the peacefulness of being underwater in a whole other world.
But it's not just known for its stunning beaches and scenery by day. It's also known as a party island by night. It doesn't have the same party reputation, though, as nearby Koh Phanong, which is an oversized island known for spectacular and rowdy full moon parties that draw in thousands of young tourists every year.
I had no idea what a full moon party was, but it sounded like a lot of fun. But it also made me feel like I was going to see hairy werewolves out there. But actually, it's a monthly party and it's a lot like a rave.
Exactly. Instead of silver bullets, they have glow sticks, fire dancers, lots of music, drugs, and face painting. And it can attract up to like 30 to 50,000 people. But back in Koh Tao, despite having only a population of 2,000 Thai locals, in 2014, over 500,000 tourists visit annually, especially young travelers who come to let their hair down, drink, dance, and swim all night until the sun comes up.
I like how it has face painting and drugs.
Right.
Like it has face painting and drugs. It is a huge party. I saw some of these pictures. We'll put them up on the screen. You can tell the people are just living it up there. But that's a lot of people living in such a small space, and that's a huge number of tourists coming in as well. But this is what the island relies on for its economy to stay as strong as it can. On average, there's about 10,000 people on this island every day, including the Westerners visiting and thousands of Burmese workers who migrate to this area for work.
And tourist Hannah was finally there to experience everything the island had to offer. As promised, she regularly made calls home and sent messages every day she was there, reassuring her mom Sue that she was fine. She updated her on everything that was happening. Since arriving in Thailand, Hannah and her friends had been staying in jungles with some of the locals and gave elephants baths and took cooking classes. And Hannah even bought a Thai cookbook so she could recreate the incredible food she had for her family once she got back home. But even though Hannah was checking in every day, her mother Sue was still going out of her mind with worry, especially after learning that Hannah was trekking all around Thailand. But when Hannah finally contacted her loved ones to say that she arrived safely at her final destination in Koh Tao on Friday, September 12th, Sue felt she could finally relax. She knew Hannah wouldn't be doing anything risky like riding scooters, which she didn't want her to do since it's an activity that often results in injuries for tourists.
Yeah, I have seen so many people get in terrible accidents on scooters. There's a girl I follow on Instagram who went out and got in a terrible accident. She had brain damage, everything, and she was in this other country. So it's so hard because you don't really want to get injured somewhere else where your family's super far away. But that's one of my fears. That's why I don't get on them. I won't even get on them. But back to Hannah. She didn't have plans to ride around on scooters. As we explained, this was a small island and people usually walked everywhere. There was actually a small brick road referred to as the Yellow Brick Road, even though it wasn't yellow in color, and it ran through the town in the middle of the portion of the island called Sairee. And this is a beach, and people would use this road to get to different beaches, bars, markets, and stores nearby. The path was between the Ocean View Resort and a bar at the end of the brick road called the AC Bar. So it was frequented a lot by people like Hannah and her friends who were staying in that area.
The only things on Hannah's agenda for Koh Tao were hanging out with friends, going to bars to have a few drinks, swimming, and sunbathing. She and her friends booked a room at the Ocean View Bungalow on the eastern shore of the island, overlooking the turquoise waters of Sairee Beach, which is known as the best beach in all of Thailand, not just because of the beautiful crystal clear waters, the sand, and the palm trees. It's actually because of the amenities. There are bars near the water, a walking path, and tons of nightlife, as Kimber explained.
It also has this famous palm tree that bows real low and it bends almost touching the water. And its shallow water makes it a great place for snorkeling. But it's really the nightlife, like John said, that people love because they like to watch the sunset while paddleboarding or sitting right on the sand having dinner at the many hotels and resorts that have bungalows on the beach. I'm really trying to paint a picture for you of how beautiful this beach really is.
But the nightlife is why people really come to this particular area of Thailand. I mean, the beaches are great during the day, but at night they come alive with bands playing music, bonfires, perfect weather, and lots of bars serving drinks that are way cheaper than what you'd find here in America.
Yes, one American dollar is equal to 36 Thai baht, which is their local currency. And for example, a beer over there would be 50 baht, which is only $1.36. So you can only imagine how far your money can go on a night out. And that's one of the reasons people like to party there.
Once Hannah and her friends got checked into their room at the Ocean View Resort in room A5, they got acquainted with all it had to offer.
But I have to say, it's kind of the typical resort that you'd find that doesn't exactly have like the best furniture or fancy decor. Instead, it's a bed to sleep on and really is more budget looking on the inside. And the girls stayed in a small room and only had two beds that were a little bigger than a twin size. We're showing you the exact room on the screen if you're watching. It had a small mini fridge, a little desk with a stool in front of a mirror, and a small bathroom with a toilet, sink, and shower. It's the outside that makes the resort worth it. The balcony looks right out over the private Sairee beach. And this is what the view is like. The beach has a view of mountains, lots of rock formations right on the sand and in the water, and even a little bridge crossing a moat that leads to places where you can rent out boats and kayaks. The resort offers things like laundry services, and it's literally steps away from the ocean. When I was looking at it on Google Maps, I even saw a banner that read Koh Tao pub crawl, and it looked like it had a picture of it with a bunch of people partying. So partying is definitely a huge draw for tourists, and many young people make the 2-hour boat ride over to this island for that very reason, to hang out, let loose, stay the night, leave the next day, or many times extend their trip because it's so much fun.
When the girls got settled at their resort, they met other tourists staying nearby. There was a group of 3 guys staying in a room right in front of theirs in K8. It's a little nicer and more expensive than the room Hannah and her friends were staying in. It had 3 beds, and it also had a balcony overlooking Sairee Beach. Those guys were David Miller, who we already introduced you to, and his 2 friends, Chris and James Ware. On Sunday, September 14th, David video called his family to let them know how things were going. He was overwhelmed by Koh Tao's natural beauty, describing it as a paradise. He was excited to go snorkeling that day and showed his family the incredible ocean views from his balcony, telling them, "I've never been happier than here." That evening, Hannah and her friends were invited to join David and his group for drinks at a local bar. They met up that evening sometime before 7.
I think he also went to the full moon party that's on the other island because I saw some pictures of him with the face paint. So they were living it up and it is so beautiful there. And if you're watching, here's a picture of the group having drinks together. There's Hannah on the left, and across the table, there's David.
David thought this would be the perfect way to wind down his stay on the island because he and Chris would leave the next couple of days. James had already made his way out to Bangkok, where they would meet again before David flew home. So around 7 p.m. that Sunday night, everyone headed out to Chopper Sports Bar on Sairee Beach, about a 3/4 mile walk from their hotel. They had some drinks and watched the soccer game, and soon the crowd got larger. There were around 50 people there. Everyone was having a great time hanging out with their friends, dancing, drinking, and getting to know new people, and just soaking up the local hospitality.
Then several hours later, at 12:15 a.m., the group decided to split up. Hannah went to another location, the AC Bar and Beach Club that we told you about, and it's at the far end of the Yellow Brick Road. It's about a 15-minute walk away from where they currently were, but closer to where their bungalow was. She left with 3 of her friends, while David and his friends stayed behind. Now, right before 1 a.m., David left the bar alone and went to a local store. Then he returned to meet up with his friends back at Choppers. Then around 1:26 a.m., David and his group of friends left to walk over to the AC Bar and meet back up with Hannah's group.
So it's around 2 a.m. on September 15th. David and Chris rejoined Hannah and her friends at the AC Bar. At some point after this, Hannah and David decided to get some air and take a walk. So they left the bar together through the rear door, which led back to the hotel via Sairee Beach.
Now, I want to point out what kind of establishment the AC Bar is. This place is pretty wild. Now, during the day, it looks like a nice family-friendly beach resort. There's kids in the swimming pool. There's people snorkeling offshore, shoppers checking out what the locals have to offer at little shops. But boom, when it turns to night, it is like a place that just transforms into the most wild area with tons of tourists just piling in. There's pool tables, fire dancers, and everyone can get right into the pool outside or the hot tub. So there's crowds of drunk people. They're like half naked, standing outside near the beach, watching these fire dancers or waiting in the pool or just standing there dancing and hanging out. We've been showing a bunch of photos and videos on the screen, but if you're not watching, just imagine spring break wildness contained to one location on a beautiful beachside at night. And that night, it was just gorgeous outside. The weather was perfect, and there were people all around on the streets, tons of people in bars, and all kinds of things happening. But the beach itself, near the water, was quiet and dark. And you can see how AC Bar leads right out to the water, and you can take the beach all the way back to the Ocean View Resort. That's the route David and Hannah chose, maybe to talk, enjoy the sounds of the waves breaking on shore, or the moonlight as they took the 4-minute walk back to their hotel. And even though it's loud near the bars, if you got closer to the water where Hannah and David were enjoying their walk, it's quiet and peaceful.
David's and Hannah's friends weren't worried about the couple heading back by themselves. They weren't going back alone. They were doing what they were supposed to do, using the buddy system.
And David was athletic. He's a guy. He's known to be the type to stand up for himself and others. So making that short walk wasn't an unsafe thing to do in their minds. And like I said, it's only a 4-minute walk from AC Bar back to the Ocean View Resort. And I think we've all been there when our friends may want to continue partying, but you kind of just want some peace and quiet, or you just want to go back to your hotel and rest. No one thought anything about David and Hannah making their way back alone. But just hours later, as the sun was coming up that Monday morning, a local Thai hotel and bar manager, 45-year-old Montriwat Tuichian, was abruptly woken up by one of his employees, a Burmese beach cleaner who had been at work cleaning Sairee Beach from the previous night. The man was mute, he could not speak, so he brought his daughter along to explain what was going on. Earlier that morning, between 4 and 5 a.m., the man's daughter, Auchu Chana, had seen something while she was working in that area and frantically ran to her father to tell him that she had just seen something on the beach that she would never, ever forget. Something that would be in her mind forever. Something terrible had happened, and she brought her father to see what it was. Now they were leading Montriwat down to the beach, where he was confronted with a very gruesome sight. It was a lot to take in. It's not something that many of us will ever witness in our entire lifetimes, and it was something out of the ordinary for this area of Thailand. There, lying on the sand, behind some tall rocks on Sairee Beach, was the half-naked body of a young Caucasian woman. Her face and head were a bloody mess. She was unrecognizable. Her teeth were smashed, chipped, crooked, and broken. Her white skirt had been pushed above her waist, exposing her white tan-lined bikini area contrasted against her sun-kissed skin. She wasn't wearing any panties, and her legs were spread wide open in a very unusual position that did not look natural. Her pink tube top was pulled down to her waist, showing the bikini top tan lines on her chest, and her breasts were completely exposed. It appeared as though she had been sexually violated and struck on the face and head with something that left deep, gaping wounds. Now, I have seen these crime scene photos. I also showed them to John. They are not something that I would ever want anyone to see, but we both examined them in order to understand exactly what was being observed at the time. And all of this will come into play in this case when authorities are trying to piece together what happened.
Nearby the sidewalk, down a path leading to where the young woman's body was found, were a pair of men's underwear and a pair of pants next to them with the belt still attached but undone. One black right sandal and one gray and dark blue shirt in the sand, which had patches that were mixed with blood, skin, and human tissue. Then a bit further down the beach where the water lapped the shore, around 40 feet from where the woman's body was lying, floated the body of a young Caucasian man in the shallow water. Apart from one sock, he too was naked. He was floating face down and had also sustained multiple injuries to his head, with one side looking as though he had been struck multiple times with a blunt object, and there was a chop mark to his back. He also had wounds to his face, broken teeth, and gashes on his chin and shoulders. At approximately 6 a.m., Matrawat alerted local police at the Koh Tao substation. Lieutenant Chakrapan Kauko from the Koh Phangan Provincial Police was currently on duty. So just so you understand what the police force is like on this island, there are usually only 3 to 6 police officers on Koh Tao at any given time.
That is not a lot for how many people are on that island.
From what we gathered, they only come out and tend to issues during bigger events and holidays. Otherwise, their presence is very minimal. So that morning, Sergeant Major Apichet Chordguha and Lieutenant Chakrapan Kauko were the first officers on the scene. The exact location was near the reef on Sairi Beach at Mu 1 Koh Tao sub-district near the statue of King Rama V. The officers were able to verify the report that 2 Caucasian foreigners were deceased on the beach. Sergeant Chordguha was taken aback by what he saw. Those were his words. He went on to say that his first impression of the scene was that it was too violent.
It was like he was saying it was over the top. And the next thing he said was interesting to me going forward because he mentioned that this area is surrounded by temples. And then he said that he hoped God would punish the person that committed this crime. But I really want all of you to hang on those words. The most important ones are about the temples, not about God punishing anyone. It's true. Not only is the statue of King Rama V merely steps away, who's known as one of the greatest and most beloved of their kings, but there's also a shrine there for locals to worship. It's important to note that these shrines are for the guardian spirits that the Thais believe in, and they're typically built in front of businesses and homes. Thais believe that these spirits will keep evil away and will bring good fortune to the people who live and work on the land. So locals will go and honor their spirits by worshiping and leaving gifts on these altars. Places where statues are located are considered more sacred than other areas. The main religion in Thailand is Theravada Buddhism. It's the oldest and most conservative brand of Buddhism. Theravada means the way of the elders. All of this is very important to understand about the culture where this crime occurred. Now, I know that most of you are used to how things are done in the United States or maybe even the UK, but when it comes to investigations in a place like Thailand, things are done differently. And when I say differently, what I'm trying to say is unorganized. Their systems just aren't the same as the ones we're used to. Things like chain of custody, preserving a crime scene, CSI technicians, and forensics just aren't anywhere near what you would expect. And this crime would be huge for even a well-versed investigator in the States. And right away, Thai officials were way over their heads. But this is not something they would admit to. There were only 6 officers currently on the island when all of this went down. And this is clearly a double murder. And it was a much more brutal than the usual deaths that they've seen on Turtle Island.
From the beginning, things were just done wrong, very sloppy and unprofessional. They needed help, so people who were not officers were assisting, walking right into the crime scene. Not to mention how fast word traveled on this small island. It didn't take long before tourists were actually coming down to the beach where the corpses were still exposed and actually acting like it was just another photo op. People had the audacity to take pictures of these deceased people and post them online on social media where the public could access them. This was happening way before they were identified and loved ones could be notified.
It was just so disrespectful and inhumane, and the officers tried to get all the help they could. So that's why civilians were actually attempting to rope off this area where the bodies were. And in trying to make sure that they were secured, they moved the bodies before they were examined. One of the first rules of death investigation is not to move the body and to get as many pictures or videos of exactly what the scene looked like. But instead, the clothing was picked up and folded and placed on one of the rocks. The bodies were haphazardly placed on blue tarps and then dragged up the beach. And all of this made my stomach just, it was turning. It was making me sick. If I were a loved one of these victims, I would not be able to stomach the way the deceased were treated. But I also understand why these seemingly careless things were happening. For one, the tide was coming in. We're talking about the beach here. They were worried that evidence would be washed away. The male victim had already been in the water for some time and rigor had set in. So they turned him over right when they found him to inspect the damage to his head. Then they pulled him up on shore until they moved him onto one of those tarps.
But while all this was happening, locals were standing right beside the bodies. For example, Montrewat, who alerted the police to the victims, was standing right next to the male body on the shore right at the crime scene with the officers. You can see the victim's leg in this picture. Why was Montrewat allowed to be down there? This is only one questionable thing that was going on. Montrewat is a Thai local. He's well known in the area, and interestingly, he is the brother of the owner of the AC bar where Hannah and David were last seen. Montrewat manages the bar alongside his nephew, 22-year-old Warat, and I'm sure you've been able to guess that Hannah and David are the two individuals now lying lifeless on Sairi Beach.
The 6 officers are seen at the water's edge as they begin to place and then drag the bodies up the beach toward the sidewalk. We have a photo of this with the locals and civilians just standing among them and pointing and looking at things right on the crime scene. Their footprints, DNA, anything could be deposited all around this area that needs to be analyzed. They're not just contaminating the scene, but they could be destroying crucial evidence. And once the bodies were on these tarps and dragged far enough up the shore, ropes were used to tie these tarps closed, and both bodies were pretty much dumped into the back of a vehicle. And this made me angry to see. These pictures are just not what I'm used to. It's bad enough to know there's a deceased person in a body bag, but something about the tarps and the ropes, it just rubbed me the wrong way.
The bodies were being transported to Koh Tao Medical Hospital so autopsies could be conducted. When they arrived, medical personnel helped to remove the bodies from the back of the vehicle and bring them inside.
And again, looking at this just made me sad, but I understand they had to use what they had available. It's not like what we see with a gurney and victims being handled with care and dignity. They were just kind of picked up and moved to a metal table to be carried inside. Meanwhile, officers from what's known as the Evidence Investigation Bureau 8 of Surat Thani were sent out to investigate the scene and collect evidence for further examination. When they arrived, things got a bit more organized. They secured the area that they believed was the crime scene, and they thought it extended to a location just up the shore where a large log was located in front of a dive shop. So this is where they began putting up the crime scene tape to cordon off the entire area.
What directed them to that part of the beach was what they found inside a little vegetable garden, a wooden garden hoe with blood on the end of it. The garden itself and the garden hoe belonged to a person that police referred to as Mr. O. He has no connection to the crime, but a worker of his found the bloodied garden hoe as the sun came up after the bodies were found. He brought it to Mr. O, who told him to go put it back where he found it, which was inside the little garden area. The police were notified and then they collected it.
So this garden hoe, when I first looked at it, I didn't realize this, but just so you know, there's a metal portion on the bottom where you actually use it to tend the garden, and then the wooden part is the top where the place you hold it is. I just had to understand that because things coming forward didn't make sense to me at first. And I am kind of obsessed with mapping things out. And I was able to narrow down this exact area. I matched the tiny garden to a picture I found online. And then I matched that to Google Maps and the fence that was in the back. And then I matched the tree. So I was able to pinpoint this exact area in front of a white fence where there's a big pine tree and where you can still see after all these years a large log that many people hang out on and relax and take pictures. This is where the evidence was found and right near where the garden hoe was located in this tiny garden, just thrown there after being discarded and then located by the worker.
The evidence in this area was 3 cigarette butts that seemed newer. They were lying right near the log. They also collected the clothing, a black flip-flop, a plastic bag, and a used condom closer to where the bodies were found. 2 bare footprints had apparently left clear depressions in the sand, like someone had stood right on that spot, almost 55 yards away from the bodies right under the log.
Now, I personally don't know how in the world they were able to differentiate that because when I looked near the cigarettes, I saw a bunch of shoe impressions. So it must have been before the officers or the tourists trampled in this area. I have to mention this because the clear depressions of bare feet in the sand that they were calling out as evidence become very significant, even though to me, that was the least important evidence on site.
Right, but what investigators took note of was that the bodies had been lying in the open for less than a few hours, even though rigor had set in, so they believed the deaths occurred not too long before they'd been found, around 4 a.m.
Right, but the decomposition process actually begins minutes after death. So that makes sense as well because the conditions, the water, the wet area, the wind, and everything.
The scene was so violent, it looked like whoever had committed the brutal slayings had done so out of extreme anger, maybe even jealousy. There were pools of blood down in a trail where the men's clothing was found. It led down to the water where David was floating face down.
Even though news of this horrifying discovery spread like wildfire across Koh Tao, details were few. No one immediately knew who these victims were or how they got to the beach, let alone who had killed them or why. But locals took it upon themselves to act quickly. In an attempt to stop the killer from fleeing back to the mainland by the only means possible, residents were the ones who actually blockaded the island's only pier at 11 a.m., which police had failed to do by that time. And eventually, as news traveled, it did get to Hannah and David's friends, and they informed authorities that both of them were missing and gave an identification of Hannah and David along with their passports, which were able to be matched to the victims even as bad as the damage was to Hannah's face. The information that was passed between the friends and the authorities as to what David and Hannah were wearing the last time they saw them and their overall features, as well as where they had gone before they went missing, all added up. And soon, the bodies were preliminarily identified as those of Hannah Witheridge and David Miller. They had been so close to making it back to their hotel from the bar that night. They were less than 100 feet away from where the Ocean View bungalows were.
But the local Thai police would have their work cut out for them. And when the news of what was happening in Koh Tao reached senior law enforcement officials in Bangkok, they were not impressed to learn that the local police were rumored to be mishandling things so early on, even though this may have been because they were too inexperienced or under-resourced to do so. Given the victims were foreign nationals, Thai police knew the international spotlight would now be on authorities to conduct a timely and thorough investigation, apprehend the killer, and swiftly bring them to justice. Any delays, incompetence, or worse, like perceptions of corruption, would be extremely humiliating for the Thai government. And it would adversely affect their reputation as a tourist mecca, which they couldn't afford. Therefore, a senior officer was sent out from the Royal Thai Police headquarters in Bangkok. His name is Suwat Junyudsuk. He's a major general and put in charge from this point forward. The first thing he needed to do was contact David and Hannah's families to let them know the horrific news of their murders. He made contact with the British consular officials who then went out to both families' residences to break the tragic news.
Police arrived to Hannah's home shortly before 10 a.m., and her parents, Tony and Sue, had actually separated by this point. They had been divorced for a couple years, so Tony was the one to get the news. The shock and immediate pain was unimaginable. And then Tony was the one who had to tell Sue and their children what happened to their free-spirited, caring little girl. Sue later recalled how Tony burst into the kitchen and he collapsed. He was just sobbing as he broke the news. When the media went to speak to Hannah's family, Tony told them, quote, "I really don't want to speak with anyone at this time. As you can imagine, we just had the most devastating news of the death of our daughter this morning. We are distraught," end quote.
David's mom, also named Sue, just like Hannah's mother, first heard the news on the radio, though no names had been released at that time. But something in Sue's gut told her that one of the victims was her son. She frantically tried calling David and sent him multiple emails, but got no response. So when the police showed up at the Miller's door, she just knew. And it was the worst news possible, worse than any nightmare either family could have ever imagined.
Wow, and I can't even imagine. And her mother's intuition had kicked in. She knew. And these poor families. And back in Thailand, the Thai foreign minister extended his condolences via the British foreign secretary. He said, quote, "On behalf of the Royal Thai government and the people of Thailand, I would like to extend to you and through you our sincere condolences and sympathy to the bereaved families for their irreparable losses," end quote. He added that ensuring the safety of overseas visitors to Thailand was the highest priority of the Thai government, and they also sent more officials out to the scene of the crime. Lieutenant General Pan Yam Mayman was sent from Bangkok to supervise the investigation in Koh Tao, while Colonel Songsak arrived from the neighboring island of Koh Phangan to assist as well. Hannah and David's families were completely traumatized, knowing that these graphic images of their children's bodies had been splashed all over the internet. They quickly received a personal apology from Major General Sawat Jang Yusuk. He called David's dad, Ian, and spoke to him directly, telling him he was so sorry. But so much unnecessary emotional damage had already been done. Hannah's family released a statement via the British Foreign Office saying, quote, "Hannah made each and every day that little bit more wonderful. Our family is utterly devastated and shocked by what has happened to our beautiful Hannah. To lose her in the way that we have is beyond comprehension. We are heartbroken and no words can possibly describe how we feel. As such, we'd be extremely grateful to be left in peace while we come to terms with our loss."
David's family also released a statement paying tribute, saying in part, quote, "David was very giving to his family and friends, and we all adored him. He will be sorely missed," end quote. David's heartbroken girlfriend, Jessie, posted on the Facebook page saying, quote, "My best friend and the love of my life. We were meant to have so much more time together, but I'll continue loving you every day forever," end quote. Even though David had only been on his Australian work placement for a brief period, he had clearly made a positive impact on his coworkers and management. The managing director of Consolidated Minerals released a statement expressing their deep sadness in hearing of David's brutal murder. So did his former high school, which said, quote, "David's tragic death, and in such dreadful circumstances, has come as a real shock to those who knew him and worked with him. He was a young man of huge potential. He was a confident, articulate member of the college community with a good circle of friends. There was so much he could be doing with his life, and to have it cut short in the way it was is really unbelievably cruel," end quote.
Locals were also deeply affected at the unexplained and shocking violence that had occurred in such an idyllic part of the world which they called home. Vigils were held for Hannah and David as Koh Tao residents gathered to pray and to light candles in their honor. A memorial area was set up right near the sidewalk leading to where their bodies were found, and many people came to place flowers and other mementos to honor them. Evidence from the scene was also being processed, including the garden hoe, a used condom, and the discarded cigarette butts, which were a brand called L&M. The blood samples from the garden hoe were sent out to the Central Evidence Investigation Bureau at the National Police Headquarters for analysis. Hannah and David's bodies were taken to the Institute of Forensic Medicine in Bangkok, and Police Colonel Dr. Pawat Parchipwiswarat, MD, the director of the institute, conducted a forensic autopsy examination on Tuesday, September 16th.
First, let's give you some information about David's injuries. He had been bludgeoned, and the weapon inflicted deep gashes on the left side and back of his head. Oblique and jagged tear wounds were found on the back upper left part of his scalp. There were also jagged tear wounds on both left and right temples, and the same type of wounds to his right and left cheekbones. David also had several scratches on his back. Both cheekbones, the eye sockets, and his upper jaw had been broken and deformed. It was clear from the defensive wounds to David's hands that he had put up a fight against his attacker. The presence of water in his lungs indicated he was drowned after being dragged down to the water. The manner of death was ruled a homicide, and the cause was a combination of blunt force trauma to his head and drowning.
And we are reading this from the official report. That's why when we're using things like jagged tears and whatnot, that's their language, and it is just terrible. And there will be a lot more to all this, and it will make more sense. But now I have to tell you about what happened to poor Hannah, who sustained much more damage and was violently attacked in a very horrific manner. It's probably the worst autopsy and crime scene photos that I've ever seen in my life, and I've seen some pretty bad ones. So there were those same deep, jagged tear wounds found on her head and the left and right side of her face. There were multiple wounds that were straight across, exactly like what you would see from the end of that garden hoe, and it appeared as though it was shoved down so hard over and over again onto her upper skull, across her forehead area, to where the depth actually reached her brain. The top half of her head was almost detached from just above the eyes upward, and also half of her face from the right of her right eye to the back of her head. It was almost detached as well. It was just horrific. Unbelievable. It's the worst that I've ever seen done to someone, especially by force and not something like a gunshot. Her skull and brain matter was exposed through a huge gash in her forehead. And of course, the bones in her forehead were broken. Both her right and left eye sockets were broken and deformed. Her lower and upper jaws were broken and out of place. There were puncture wounds to her right cheek area, and it appeared as though the severe damage was done either post-mortem or while she was completely unconscious. But we will get to that in just a bit. In her left hand, she clutched a strand of blonde hair. And I don't know if this hair was ever sent for testing because I don't really hear too much about it later, but I know that it was collected. Now I want to talk about the bottom half of her body. So moving down, there was a mark that resembled a bite wound on her right nipple that was swabbed for saliva. There was also a tear in the lower portion of her vulva. It was about 1 inch by a 1/2 inch in diameter, and bruises were found from the bottom of her vulva to the rectum, and these were about 1 inch by 1.5 inches in diameter. Where she was found, she was lying on her back with her legs spread, and this, coupled with the wounds in that area, made it clear that she was sexually violated. Both her vagina and her rectum were swabbed for DNA, and it appeared as though there were semen in both of these areas. And those samples were then transferred to the Blood, Biochemical, and Gunpowder Soot Testing Unit, which was supervised by Colonel Wat T.S. Wat Ming Kung for analysis. Her manner of death was homicide, and her cause was from severe head wounds by a blunt object. Considering the garden hoe was in such close proximity to these bodies, and there was blood on the bottom portion of that metal part, it matched the type of wounds inflicted. So it was concluded that this was the murder weapon in both David and Hannah's cases.
And because of the sexual nature of the crime, it was believed at this point, without a full investigation, that Hannah was the target of a sexually motivated attack. They thought it was possible a man wanted to have sex with her, and that David probably stood in the way of the killer having his way with her. So David was beaten and then dragged to the water so that the killer could subdue Hannah and force himself on her.
Which is just so sad, but it's also something that's actually not too uncommon, even here, everywhere. But now, because investigators knew that Hannah and David had been out on the island at various bars the night of the murders, they were gathering CCTV footage from nearby bars, restaurants, hotels, and stores, especially any that happened to be in close proximity to the crime scene. Unfortunately, despite the fact there were 300 CCTV cameras installed all around Syrie Beach, only 106 of them were operable on the night of the murders. So this severely limited the amount of footage available. But bits and pieces of footage started to show Hannah and David, and they managed to gather videos from about 17 different cameras. Now, I don't think that all of this footage was leaked or shown to the public, but we did manage to get a hold of a few of them. In one video, this is around 7 p.m., and you can see Hannah on the left of the screen. She's in the pink tube top, white skirt, and she's walking in between two of her girlfriends down the street on the island between bars, restaurants, and outdoor vendors. This is probably as they were making their way to that first bar of the night, which was Chopper's Sports Bar, where she met up with David and his friends. That's where they took that photo of all of them sitting together. About 47 minutes later, this same camera catches David walking in the middle of his two friends, a woman and a man, and David is wearing the gray and navy t-shirt and shorts, along with a pair of black shoes, and he's making his way in the same direction that Hannah and her friends were going. It seems completely normal. Hannah and David, they're just walking and talking with their friends.
The same camera catches Hannah again with 3 of her friends, now walking in the opposite direction, back the way they came, just 7 minutes after midnight. This was when the friends split up from the group, and Hannah and her friends went to the AC bar while David and his friends stayed behind at Chopper's. The camera catches David walking by himself around 2:55 a.m. This is when he went to the grocery store before meeting back at Chopper's. Then at 1:56 a.m., the CCTV footage shows David and his 3 friends, a woman and 2 men, walking back to the AC bar where they meet up with Hannah's group.
What I think is interesting is I looked up the AC bar and it closes at 2 a.m. So I wondered, okay, are people allowed to hang out around the bar, finish up their drinks or what? Because the last time anyone saw David and Hannah was around 2:15 a.m. when they were allegedly trying to get one last drink before heading back to their hotel. After that, they're kind of unaccounted for until their bodies are found a 4-minute walking distance away a few hours later. I tried Googling what people do after hours and I couldn't find too much, but what I did find was that locals kind of tell people to make it back to their hotels after 2 a.m. as if nothing good comes out of going out to places after that. And you'll find out more about this later as evidence is being gathered and people are being questioned. But at this point, the intense pressure for law enforcement to find the person or persons responsible wasn't going to be easy or straightforward to manage. They needed to find the guilty party and fast. But they also had to ensure that all the I's were dotted and all the T's were crossed. There was pressure from all sides, not just from Hannah and David's families, but influential locals on Koh Tao, the British government, the Thai prime minister. So they knew they needed to figure it out.
So Thai authorities were deeply concerned about how the murders would impact both Thailand's image globally as well as their tourism on the island and for the country as a whole. Remember, Thailand's tourism accounts for 12.5% of the nation's economy.
Yeah, and it's interesting. It was initially briefly reported that Hannah wasn't a victim of any kind of sexual violations. But it appears this was a narrative that was cultivated by the police, and it was designed to minimize any negative publicity.
And the tourism industry was already recovering from a military coup that previous May, which had affected tourist numbers due to martial law now being in place.
Right, and that was difficult because now you couldn't get travel insurance for Thailand because the country was under this martial law.
This wasn't a good thing for tourists, considering there were rising concerns around incidents of robbery, assault, extortion, and scams preying on Westerners. This in turn posed the risk of rushing the investigation into Hannah and David's murders.
And when I was doing my research, I was actually shocked by how many deaths of tourists had occurred in Koh Tao.
Me too.
I was able to find out that there's been mysterious deaths happening there as far back as the 90s, but because of the internet wasn't like it is today, this wasn't reported as much. While Koh Tao was one of the hottest and most idyllic tourist destinations in Thailand, it wasn't without a sinister side. And this is just what Hannah's family feared. I mean, it's actually known as Death Island. I found a Facebook page with the same name, and it was dedicated to exposing mysterious deaths that are actually believed to be murders that are covered up by corrupt police and other powers at play. For example, in January 2000, Ian Jacobs from Birmingham, UK, traveled alone to Koh Tao for a diving vacation, and just 2 weeks later, he was found at the bottom of a well. His neck was broken, and he had suffered from head trauma. He was then promptly cremated in Bangkok. and his death was ruled an accident. Police stated that Ian got drunk, and when he was making his way back to his bungalow, he stumbled and fell right into the well. However, witnesses in that area disputed this. There was like, there is no way you can stumble into a well that's sticking out of the ground. So one of Ian's friends, Mick Locke, traveled all the way there to investigate for himself. And let's just say he was not welcomed. Police recommended that he leave ASAP, and he wasn't able to get any pictures of the area where Ian allegedly accidentally died. And later, he found out that Ian had borrowed money from a Thai man on the island shortly before his death. So those close to him believe that he was killed. And there is an entire YouTube channel called Koh Tao Murders Death Island where all the victims are talked about. And one video had at least 24 outsiders that died of suspicious circumstances over the years. And I will link it below so you can watch it later. Don't go watch it now. Don't leave. We want to explain what happens next. But there's a lot of speculation around people with power on the island and in Thailand.
Powerful families who own much of the island exert significant influence both administratively and in local commerce. They're dubbed as the local mafia, though it's not in the same way as we think of it in terms of European or American crime families, but there are some similarities, mainly when it comes to how businesses are run. A few of those 24 people in the video Kimbyr mentioned were trying to start companies in Koh Tao when they ended up dead. The successful Tuichian family has a monopoly on businesses on the island, and it's targeted at the tourist dollar.
Yeah, it's not a surprise that these people are trying to open businesses. Maybe they don't want to comply with the powers that be, and they go missing, end up dead. But by the way, that family that he just mentioned, the Tuichian family, that is Montrewat's family. You know, the guy that called the police to report the bodies at the beach. Yeah, and he was the one that we saw on the crime scene with police while this investigation was going on. And that's interesting, isn't it? So concerns were growing that perhaps David and Hannah had been met with foul play due to encountering someone that was linked to these families, whose history on this island goes back generations.
Soon, rumors started swirling that Montrewat and his family were somehow involved. After all, Montrewat not only reported the bodies, he was one of the first Thai locals on the scene. And on top of that, he managed the AC bar where Hannah and David were last seen. The bar was owned by his brother, Voropan, who was known as the local headman. And it was also run by Montrewat's 22-year-old nephew, Warat, who is Warapan's son.
I hope that's not too confusing. It's a family business. And the nephew actually went by the nickname Namsat. We're not going to go there right now because this is getting way too confusing. But let's just say, like I said, family affair. And because of all these connections, questions began to be asked about Montrewat's whereabouts at the time of the murders, as well as his 22-year-old nephew, who is said to have fled the island for Bangkok soon after the murders. Social media was going crazy about the Tuichian family. They know everything that's happening on the island. They know when the tourists are coming in and out, and even whether they have money or not. This family owns more businesses on Sairi Beach than any other family. And the fact that Montrewat seemed to be playing a big role in this investigation didn't sit right. Of course, the media wants to hear from him, so he does an interview right at the beach where the bodies were located. And he insists that he didn't touch anything at all. Those were his words. Further, he stated he doesn't see anything wrong with his actions.
He later explained that investigation director flew to Koh Tao and they approached him because he was the first person to see the bodies and was in any capacity to explain what he observed. So he said he'd been involved in the investigation because of that connection, not for any nefarious reasons though.
But it was like he was doing his own investigation, and I do understand that these were patrons of his family's establishment before they were killed. And maybe he was trying to be helpful, so he's going around trying to gather evidence and talk to people. But it just didn't sit well, especially with outsiders that had heard all the rumors of corruption in the past.
And speaking of those outsiders, initially investigators insisted that only a foreigner could be responsible for something so brutal. Either way, while they were still looking into Montrewat and his nephew Warat, police were also interested in formally speaking with David and Hannah's friends and anyone else who interacted with the victims. For one, the owner of the Ocean View bungalows was in disbelief that something so brutal had occurred. He he knew Hannah and David as happy, friendly guests. They gave him no trouble at all while they were staying at his bungalow and didn't seem to have a problem with anyone. He was at a loss to understand how someone could have attacked them so viciously for just a short walk from their rooms.
Just 2 days after the murders, David's friends, Chris and James, they were due to fly out of Bangkok. Now, all three men had shared a room in Koh Tao. However, James had left, I think, a day before the bodies were found, but police wanted to rule Chris out as being the source of that blonde hair that was found in Hannah's hand at the crime scene. Now, visually, the hair didn't appear to match Hannah or David's, and it appeared to be, to the pathologist, a blonde color that could match Chris's. So police were considering whether they had been in some kind of love triangle involving Chris, David, and Hannah, and that the killings may have been a crime of passion. But I was sitting there thinking to myself, these people only knew each other for a couple days before the murders. So that seemed pretty extreme for there to be some kind of like twisted love triangle. And let's not forget that David did have a long-term girlfriend back home. That's not to say that what happens on Koh Tao doesn't stay there, but I don't know. I thought this theory was a little extreme.
No, the love triangle was said to have been between Chris and David, and that Chris was gay and had feelings for David since they've known each other since childhood.
Oh, okay. I get it now.
But when we saw him go off with Hannah that night, he became enraged.
Okay. That's still far-fetched to me. But they did go locate Chris in that shared hotel room at the Ocean View. And when they did, they said they found a pair of Chris's pants that were inside David's luggage, and these pants had blood on the bottom of them. So Chris also had some injuries on his hands, which police felt were suspicious. The brothers were arrested and taken in for questioning, but they weren't considered formal suspects at this stage because it might sound very different to what we're used to. But according to the BBC, formal court proceedings are required in Thailand before someone can officially be declared a suspect. However, the investigators took DNA samples from Chris and James for testing.
And at the same time, investigators were conducting all types of interviews and also considering whether a fisherman could have committed the murders, coming ashore after swimming from their boat and then disappearing into the darkness after they committed the crime. It had still only been about 3 days since the murders. All they had to go on were those bare footprints near the log. Remember those?
Yes, and I found this part of the investigation very interesting. Authorities began to require every person on the island to come have their feet measures. Now, I'm going to try not to laugh here, but one by one, each person had to hold up a piece of paper with their name on it. And then investigators would smooth out some sand. We're going to show you this. So it was flat with no depressions in it. And then the person in question would step onto that area. They would stand there for a few seconds and then they would carefully step away, leaving their bare foot impressions behind to be compared to a picture of the one from the scene, which had actually apparently been measured before when it was photographed. And then they would use a measuring tape to measure each of these people's footprints in the sand. And I am holding in my laughter because this to me does not seem scientific at all. And we have photos and videos, so we're going to be showing it while we're talking about it. And apparently, when they first examined the initial footprints, they were able to measure them and get an estimate of the potential perpetrator's height, saying that they were probably between 5'6" and 5'9" or something like that. But don't we know that this is untrue, that it doesn't have any direct correlation? And when I Googled this, I put on, does big feet mean, and it said big meat. Big feet, does big feet mean big meat? But big feet doesn't mean you're tall or short. There's no correlation there. So this was hours and hours of investigation for what I think is pretty meaningless. They were collecting people's ID information, taking pictures of them and their footprints.
But it wasn't long before news of DNA results were already being published in the media. Many publications stated that after the initial testing of the bodies and crime scene evidence, that leads were promising. And yes, less than 3 days after the murders, the authorities were already reporting that they had 2 DNA profiles recovered from inside Hannah's body, and they were from 2 Asian men. There were also 3 DNA profiles of Asian males on those cigarette butts.
And I was left with a lot of questions. This testing seemed to be completed in a very fast, like a record time compared to how long this takes here in the US and in the UK. I Googled how long DNA tests typically take, and back in 2014, even now, we know they usually take weeks to process, if not months. And the only time results or matches can come back fast is when there's a known DNA sample and then there's DNA found at a crime scene and they're tested against one another. That's different. That's like if you were to take it and put it into CODIS and there's a criminal match. Or if you took one swab from the scene and then another one from someone's cheek and you did a very basic RFLP test for DNA profiling. But even then, I couldn't find one test back then that could pinpoint someone's background, as in whether they were from Asian descent, for example. Most of us know that even today, it takes weeks for companies like 23andMe to give us our ancestry results. Now, granted, privately funded labs can do DNA testing in a matter of 48 to 72 hours. But again, these are comparative tests. So for example, let's say they swabbed Hannah and David's cheeks. Then they received the blood from the garden hoe and they processed all three. If there was enough DNA, they could match those and do a comparison test because you have both the DNA. But to just have one DNA sample and say, oh, that's Asian, that's like unheard of. And we know this. It's like almost impossible, especially with such a fast turnaround. Not to mention that if you watch trials today, you know how complicated DNA is. It's not 100%. It's always like, it's 1,000,000 times more likely than not that this person is a contributor. Right. But let's just say I'm not buying it. Something wasn't adding up.
Well, they did report that Hannah's DNA was found on the outside of the condom, and that would technically be a 1-to-1 match like you mentioned.
Yes.
They would compare to her own sample DNA.
And yes, that I can believe would be easier to test. So I think we can safely say that that's more accurate, as well as matching their blood to the garden hoe. However, they were unable to match any DNA of the inside of the condom because either there was no semen inside there or contamination occurred. But considering semen contains a lot of DNA because sperm has a high DNA concentration, I think it would be safe to say that there was no ejaculatory fluid inside that condom. And this makes sense as we go forward with other leaves that they get. Unfortunately, the lab was unable to test any of the other items at the scene, citing contamination, which is no surprise.
But now, with this supposed DNA profile of an Asian male, over 60 investigators set out on the island to work on obtaining samples from every Asian man still on Koh Tao.
And this is quite a process. It was even more intense than the footprinting. The testing included members of a Thai soccer team who had been visiting the AC bar at the same time that David and Hannah were there. But these men were later cleared. There was a reward that was announced by police for 4,000 pounds for anyone with information that would lead to an arrest. This is the equivalent to about $6,500.
A week after the murders, with still no witnesses having come forward, 2 police officers, along with good old Mom Truat, sought out to question a friend of David's named Sean McAnna. The 25-year-old busker had lived on the island for several years and knew David from back in Leeds. As it turned out, investigators found out that he was supposed to meet up with David the last night he was seen alive, but Sean had canceled, given that he was hungover. When Sean found out that David had been killed, he said he was devastated and wondered that if he'd been there, would this have happened to his friend?
However, there had been reports that his friend Sean was seen with blood on him the night of the slayings. So Montrewat and some officers chased Sean down and cornered him in a grocery store and began asking him questions. But apparently, after they began to accuse him of murdering David and Hannah, Sean ran. And a few hours later, he posted on Facebook saying, quote, "Thai mafia are trying to kill me. Please help me," end quote. And here's my biggest question at this moment. If authorities had already confirmed that the DNA inside Hannah was from an Asian male, then why are they after a white boy? It's just a question.
And that's a good question. Apparently, a British news agency was able to track Sean down. He gave a terrifying account of what he said prompted him to run that day and hide out in the jungle before fleeing the island altogether. The Telegraph interviewed him, and according to Sean, he said he was drunk when Montrewat and the officers came after him. At first, because he was under the influence, he began answering basic questions. But then they weren't just accusing him of killing Hannah and David. They were basically stating that it was a fact. Let's listen to part of that interview.
They just said to me, it was you who killed them. You've got 2 people's deaths in your hands. you know it was you. And you're gonna hang yourself tonight. You're gonna hang yourself tonight. They're gonna watch you hang. That you died tonight. So I just ran.
Wow. So according to Sean, they were saying he was going to hang himself as if they were commanding him to do it.
Right, and Sean actually heard some rumors. He had been wondering if those were true. He had heard around the locals that two Thai men had been harassing Hannah, and when David stepped in to intervene, the pair were killed, and Hannah was sexually violated. There were also people who said they witnessed the victims get into a confrontation with a man at AC Bar before leaving.
This is going to be important, but even David's dad, Ian, agreed that stepping in to help someone in trouble was exactly the sort of thing his son would do, saying, quote, that would be absolutely in his character, end quote. Lots of rumors were swirling by now about exactly what David and Hannah were doing on the beach together that night. Were they merely walking back to their hotel? Or were they having maybe a little fun one-night stand kind of thing before they both left the island? I mean, these are two attractive people, and it wouldn't be out of the realm of possibility that they were attracted to one another. However, in many Asian countries, engaging in overt physical contact, let alone sexual activity in public, is something that brings harsh penalties, and it's frowned upon as being disrespectful to the locals. It's fine within the confines of some clubs on the island, or of course, behind closed doors in private. But as I was alluding to in the beginning, when I mentioned the temples, the shrines in this area, and the Thai belief system, it's true. Public displays of affection are not well received. They're actually seen as a sign of moral decay. I read that it's not uncommon for locals to get offended at the sight of tourists wearing revealing clothing, which would be anything above the knee. And this is mostly in reference to women. Anything that's too tight, low cut, or showing the shoulders is inappropriate because in their culture, dressing conservatively is very important. Furthermore, even holding hands is scoffed at, and making out in public is seen as very disrespectful. They value privacy in romantic relationships, and they feel like their own rights are being invaded by having to view that kind of behavior. Now, it is true that Hannah was dressed for summer activities. She was baring her shoulders, she was wearing a short skirt, but so were hundreds of other women on that island.
But there was actually a screenshot of CCTV footage released by the media, and it was labeled as David and Hannah walking hand in hand toward the beach that night. We're going to put it up on the screen right now.
I knew right away that this wasn't them, but of course, it stirred up a bunch of theories. First of all, the girl has long dark hair. She's wearing a light colored tank top and what looks like jean shorts. The guy has a hat on, and eventually it was reported this was not Hannah and David. So there was absolutely nothing concrete presented to suggest that Hannah and David were doing anything more than just walking along the beach together back to their accommodations that night. And that was right before they were attacked. But we will revisit this a little bit later.
So let's go back to Sean. Montruot's version of events was that he was simply asking Sean about how he came to have blood on him that night in question. And there were two officers with him at that time, which he suggested meant the interview was more official than badgering him. He said Sean wouldn't answer, and then he just took off running.
But if you look closely at Sean's arm in that interview, there's a cut on his right forearm. It's just something that I noticed, so could he have gotten injured around the same time? Because it did look fresh.
The cut was mentioned. He claimed that any blood on him due to that small injury was sustained before September 14th. Sean was convinced that the police were trying to pin the murders on a foreigner to avoid further embarrassment.
Which wouldn't be that unheard of.
And he believed that they were using him as a scapegoat. And he also believed, like others, that Montruot was suspicious.
And he was. But then he also addressed that in another interview with the media. He said, quote, I would like the world to know that my family and I are completely innocent. People have to ask themselves what they believe, the forensic evidence or their imaginations. You have to believe the facts, end quote. Well, Mr. Brother from a powerful family that happens to also be Asian, isn't that a fact? That the DNA was from, as they were reported, an Asian male? So again, I ask, why wouldn't you be more included as a suspect than Sean, considering he's Caucasian? That's just following the facts that were known at the time to the public.
But back in Bangkok, David's other friends, Chris and James, had been released by police and had flown straight back to Britain after they were left incredibly shaken up by this entire experience. We never did hear why there was apparent blood on Chris's pants inside David's luggage, but still there was some bandages in the trash outside on the balcony of their room, so maybe a minor injury had occurred to him.
I thought so. I looked in that. We have a little bit of video of that because somebody went there and got video right after this. I don't know. No one's ever mentioned it. And honestly, there are so many things that are never cleared up in this case, which is so frustrating. But on September 23rd, the focus on Montrewat increased. He was said to resemble a man that was seen in CCTV footage near the crime scene on the night of the murders. And we have some screen grabs from that footage. I think it also have a video. And this would have been right before he supposedly called the police telling him that bodies had been found. The man is seen running shirtless from the direction of the crime scene. He does appear to have long, shaggy black hair like Montrewat's, but there are so many people that look very similar. So could it have been him even maybe running to go call police after he was alerted to the murders?
No, they weren't sure, but Montrewat and his nephew Vora were both interrogated by police, and DNA cheek swabs were taken from both of them. Even Montrewat's brother, the owner of the AC Club, was questioned. Evidence provided that ruled Vorwat out because he was a university student, and CCTV footage from the school proved he was not on the island when the murders happened. But that didn't rule Montrewat out. While it may have seemed encouraging that investigators were chasing down multiple leads at once, this was causing local and international concerns. It was well known that Thai authorities were anxious to apprehend the killer or killers. However, their inquiries didn't appear to be methodical. Instead, they were taking a surface-level scattergun approach to identifying potential suspects, and that may not stand up to judicial scrutiny. Theories as to whether there was one killer, two, or even three seemed to change from day to day so rapidly that it was difficult to determine what the most accurate and up-to-date information was.
And meanwhile, the Thai prime minister was under fire internationally over comments that he made about Western tourists after the murders. This was directed at women in particular. He actually said, quote, "There are always problems with tourist safety. They think our country is beautiful and is safe, so they can do whatever they want. They can wear bikinis and walk everywhere. I'm asking if they wear bikinis in Thailand, will they be safe? Only if they're not beautiful," end quote. Wow. Yeah. He's basically saying what I was explaining earlier. In other words, he's suggesting that if a woman is going to dress a certain way, then she can expect not to be safe.
And to do damage control, he later issued an apology in response to the outraged reactions to his comments saying, quote, "I'm sorry about the comment. I'm not judging you. I just want you to be careful," end quote.
To me, that's kind of like a sorry, not sorry response. But I want to get back to the DNA evidence and the results. The samples received from the crime scene and Hannah's body, which were said to have come from the two Asian males, didn't mean investigators were just looking at Thai nationals, because Thailand is actually a popular place for Burmese migrants to come from neighboring Myanmar to work and to fill gaps for low-skilled jobs in the Thailand labor market. Myanmar used to be called Burma. It's also a country in Southeast Asia right next to Thailand. And over there, the same jobs don't pay as well. So the Burmese people flee to Thailand for work, and it's usually low paid and labor intensive.
Migrant workers in Thailand send their Thai income to their families. At the time of the murders on Koh Tao, there were 5,000 Burmese migrants who mainly worked in the hospitality industry. But it isn't as advantageous for the Burmese as you might think. The exploitation of these migrant workers who are escaping economic instability in their own country means it's common for many to arrive undocumented, making them vulnerable to being underpaid and taken advantage of. These workers also don't have the same access to public services as Thai citizens do, unless they're willing to bribe government officials, including the police.
In one article I read said that calling them slaves wouldn't be that too far off from the way they're treated. A person who lived and worked on this island for many years and integrated into the community, who was eventually accepted as sort of a local, they posted on Reddit that, quote, "all the dirty work was done by the Burmese. They were the boat boys, cleaners, shelf stackers, dishwashers, etc., and were treated horrendously by the Thai population. Saying not much better than slaves wouldn't be an exaggeration, end quote. Almost 2 weeks after the murders, the Royal Thai Police were aggressively targeting Burmese workers on the island, and 6 in particular were said to have blood on their clothing following the murders. They weren't just being followed and verbally harassed. These men were being physically tortured to get them to confess. One man reported having boiling water poured on him, and there were pictures of these men and their injuries, which of course investigators denied. As DNA tests continued, David's friends Chris and James were finally totally eliminated as suspects, and so was Montrewat and his nephew, and 9 migrant workers who were seen near the murder scene at the time of the killings.
Police were continuing to analyze the CCTV footage. Close to the time of the killings, one camera captured 3 Burmese men riding a motorcycle. They stopped to purchase beer and L&M brand cigarettes from a 7-Eleven around 11:12 p.m., the night of the murders, before getting back on the bike and heading in the direction of Sairi Beach. Remember, L&M were the brand of cigarettes found underneath the log near the crime scene. Investigators kept progressing through the cameras, trying to see if they would spot any of these men again, since they also found 3 sets of Asian male DNA on the cigarette butts. This was the most significant lead they had.
Right, because they're seeing 3 men and they bought cigarettes, and then they're seeing 3 sets of DNA on cigarettes.
Right, so as they were combing through the footage, they noticed around 3:44 a.m., one of the men was seen running back from the direction of the beach and through an alley between a couple of buildings, again appearing on the CCTV. But this time he wasn't wearing a shirt. Police knew there was a house nearby and wondered if he lived there. The same man is seen on the same camera at 4:49 a.m. He's walking in the same direction, coming from the direction of the beach, still without his shirt, but this time at a slower pace. Then just minutes later, he's seen walking back towards the beach.
And then on October 1st, investigators go out to that house. It has now been 2 weeks since the murders, and when they arrive, they find one of the men they saw on the camera that was riding the motorcycle with those other 2 men. His name is Mau Mau. He lived there, and he told officers that the 2 other men on the motorbike with him on that footage were his 2 friends. One of them was named Zalin, and he owned that motorcycle and worked at a bar on Sairi Beach. The other was his friend Wei Pio. Mau Mau told police he had been with both of them that night, but he left his friends at the beach and borrowed the motorcycle to meet with his girlfriend. By the time he got home later, he said his 2 friends had stayed the night and were already asleep. He also told them that nothing appeared to be out of the ordinary. So investigators asked Mau Mau to take them to where he could find the 2 men. He explained that Wei Pio had recently left the island aboard a boat, headed for the mainland where he was due to start a new job. However, they were able to track down Zhao Lin, but he couldn't produce a passport, and he admitted to entering the kingdom illegally. So he was taken into custody, and his motorcycle and the clothing he'd been wearing on the night of the murders were taken into evidence. They began interviewing Zhao Lin via a Burmese translator because he could not speak Thai, and eventually he was charged with illegally entering and residing in the kingdom without permission. When questioned about his friend Wei Pio, it was discovered that he left on a night boat, and it would take about 6 hours to reach his destination. So they were able to intercept that boat, and he was also without a passport or a valid work permit, so he was arrested the next day on October 2nd and charged with the same crime as his friend. News reports actually claimed that he had been hiding on that boat, but that was disputed since he had already planned this trip to his new work destination. Both men were now being questioned about the murders, but they were apparently denied access to legal representation and an official interpreter. However, they admitted they had been on Sairi Beach the night of the murders.
Zhao Lin said he had invited Wei Pio to hang out to have a few beers. They were both 22 and from Myanmar and met up at Mau Mau's workplace and waited for him to finish work so they could hang out together. The trio bought some beers and cigarettes at the 7-Eleven and rode down to the beach, where they sat on a log under a tree and played Zhao Lin's guitar that he brought with him. They smoked and drank. And for reference, if you're watching, this is where the log is and where the bodies were found, not too far from each other. The men admitted to sharing the same cigarettes that night. They said that after about an hour, Mau Mau departed for a bit while Zhao Lin and Wei Pio were still drinking beer. Then, at around 1 a.m., Za Lin and Wei Pio went to buy more alcohol and then returned back to the log. A little later, Mau Mau returned to the beach with a bottle of wine to share with them. And they kept drinking together until Mau Mau left, taking the motorcycle to go visit his girlfriend. Za Lin and Wei Pio said they hung around a little longer. At some point, it started to rain. It was still before 2 a.m. at this point, and Wei Pio suggested they head to Mau Mau's, so they began walking down the beach in the direction of the AC bar. This would be in the opposite direction of the crime scene. When they reached the Maya bar, which is just 2 establishments before you reach the AC bar, so it's very close in proximity, Za Lin complained that he had a headache, so he asked Wei Pio if he wanted to join him for a quick dip in the water. He said sure, so they left the guitar on the patio of the AC2 restaurant, which is just after the Maya bar, and the AC2 is also owned by the same family that owns the AC bar. It's right before you get to the bar. There's a small dive shop separating the 2 establishments, but when you're on the beach, the 2 back portions of AC2 and AC bar are right next to one another.
We've been showing this on the screen, but these establishments are super close. This is only a 4-minute walk. So as you're walking from, let's say, Ocean View, which is on the end, and you're near the log, there's the shrine, there's the statue, then there's the log. And then as you're walking, there's only like a few establishments between the log and where the AC bar is. It's not very far away. Yeah. Za Lin decided to go in the water fully clothed, but Wei Pio took off his shirt and he left it on top of his shoes with the guitar at the AC2 on this back porch area. As they were wading in the shallow water, it was very dark. You could only see about 15 feet in front of you. All the bars were starting to close at this point, but there was still a lot of action going on at the AC bar. They could see a fire dancer in the distance and about 20 people standing on the beach just watching. We have a video of what this looks like if you're standing from the perspective of the AC bar, and it is really dark. Like you can see a lot going on where the light is of the fire and the bar, but once you get down near the water, it's pretty dark. AC2 restaurant was already closed, so most of the light would have been coming from the AC bar and the fire dancer. The men said that they were in their water for about 15 minutes and they didn't see anyone else walking down the beach during that time. However, when they were back on the sand at the patio near the AC2, Wei Pio noticed that his shirt and shoes were gone, along with the guitar. They walked up and down the beach for a few minutes and they couldn't locate their items. So the men just walked back to Mau Mau's house, which was nearby. Za Lin said he took off his shirt and let it hang dry on the line and then stepped out of his wet pants and went to bed. But Wei Pio, he decided to go back out and look for his things because the shirt he had been wearing belonged to Mau Mau and he needed his shoes for work the next day. So apparently, that's the person that we see on the CCTV footage roaming around the streets without a shirt. But that is interesting because he's seen running from the beach and back to Mau Mau's at 3:44. That's over an hour and a half since the AC bar had been closed and since they'd been swimming. But I guess if they went swimming, looked around for a little while, didn't find anything, went back to Mau Mau's, then he comes back out after 2 a.m., he's been down there on the beach looking around. Kind of makes sense. But he's still out there an hour later at 4:49 a.m., going again from the beach area and back a few minutes later. We know that the bodies were found sometime before 5 a.m., so this is very close to that time. Wei Pio said he searched and searched, but again, failed to find the items. So he finally made his way back to Mau Mau's, and along the way, he did find something. He found an iPhone and a pair of sunglasses on the beach in the sand between the AC2 restaurant and the Maya bar. So he picked them up and brought them back to Mau Mau's. He said he arrived home sometime between 4 and 5 a.m. Well, we know it must have been closer to 5 because we see him on CCTV before that. And him and Mau Mau actually met up before they made it home to the house. So they went in together and then they said they went to bed.
The next morning, Mau Mau was already gone for work by the time the other two men woke up. Zalin drove his motorcycle to drop Wei Pio off at his house and rode back to his own place. Around 8 a.m., Wei Pio was at his friend Ren's house where he showed off the iPhone, telling him he found it the night before. But Wei Pio didn't have the passcode. He couldn't turn it on, so he left it at Ren's to charge. However, here's an interesting thing that happened. As word of the murder spread across the island that day, Wei Pio became worried. He didn't know whose cell phone and glasses he picked up, because the truth was, he didn't find them over there at AC2 and Maya. He found them near the crime scene. He told Ren the truth, and in turn, Ren told Wei Pio that he destroyed the cell phone and disposed of it in the backyard. Then, Wei Pio destroyed the sunglasses and disposed of them as well.
That's sketchy to me.
Uh-huh.
Because why wouldn't you just turn them over to the police?
I don't know, but I could imagine they're used to police protocol, so destroying the evidence may have been beneficial for them at the time.
Because they're undocumented, they don't have, I understand, like they don't want to be involved and they're treated badly.
They told investigators they arrived in Thailand around 2012 and 2011. Neither man had a criminal record. All three men submitted to a DNA swab of their cheeks. Mau Mau was released shortly after because the police ran his DNA against the crime scene DNA.
In another one of those lightning fast tests that came back like this.
Right, and I don't know how they got the results so fast, but it did match the DNA found on the cigarette butt. But it didn't match the DNA found inside Hannah's body, so he was free to go.
I did read that at this point the FBI was involved, so maybe they were able to do faster DNA match comparisons like I mentioned. That wouldn't be as hard since they have the known sample of this man and they can compare it to the DNA at the crime scene. Officers recovered the smashed iPhone from Ren's backyard, which they proved belonged to David. They were able to take the IMEI number and match it to David's records, which is interesting because, I mean, it was found right near the crime scene, which Wei Pio lied about to his friend. And as investigators continued questioning Zalin and Wei Pio over a period of hours, they end up confessing that they were the ones who murdered both David and Hannah. There is going to be a lot more to this, of course, because this is big news. And the motive was said to have been sexual jealousy. And I hadn't heard it put that way before, but they admitted that they saw these two victims walking together down the beach. They stopped near the rocks. They began kissing. And as these two men were watching, they became aroused and they decided to snatch Hannah and have sex with her. And David, of course, put up a fight. So they had to get rid of him. And they held Hannah down. They ambushed David with the garden hoe, beat him up until he passed out, then dragged him to the water, drowned him. And then they beat Hannah until she was unconscious. And then they took turns having sex with her and then killed her and left her on the beach. Okay, so I do have a comment. Recall that I mentioned that in the Thai belief system, it's frowned upon to see public displays of affection. Well, in the Burmese culture, it's even less acceptable. Traditionally, men are viewed as superior to women, and they don't even casually date. They only begin socializing with women in their teenage years, and they're usually married by the age of 18 before ever being physical. There's also an accepted violence against women because they believe that males possess what's known as fawn. It's power, glory, and holiness, and women are expected to submit and to be virtuous and modest virgins until their wedding day, and even continue to dress modestly. So could part of this be true? That maybe Hannah and David, let's say they were kissing, maybe they were holding hands, and not only did these men get aroused because they're not used to looking at that kind of stuff, and they were intoxicated, I'm sure they've been watching nearly naked tourist women prancing around day and night on the island. So I don't think it's that far out of the realm of possibility that this could have happened. But as I was examining the crime scene, I did notice that David's clothing appeared to be taken off like someone who was, let's say, going skinny dipping, okay? Because it didn't look like his pants were ripped off or his shirt was ripped off. It looked like pants that had been stepped out of and then maybe his shirt removed, put on the beach. I don't want anyone to get mad at me for these inferences, but it's interesting to me that a used condom with Hannah's DNA was found without semen on the inside. I don't think either one of those Burmese men were carrying condoms because there's just a lot of reasons why. And David's clothes were strewn nearby, near the area where the rocks would have been concealing the couple. Remember, It's very dark over there. It's not out of the realm of possibility that maybe they were having sex, which would have been way more arousing and offensive to either a local or people of Burmese origin like these two men. I could see them confronting them during the act, and David, of course, standing up to them, which led to their murders. White women especially are seen as, and this is sad, but of lesser value and easy, kind of like a sex worker would be perceived, and maybe they just wanted some too.
There's also this belief in Thai culture about saving face. So if you are confronted or you're expected to back down, and if you show any physical protest, be it in any form of perceived violence and or aggression, then expect it to be met with force. Expect to get beaten up, basically.
Yeah, exactly. And we're getting ahead of ourselves at this point, but let me tell you what happened next. In front of select media, a police video was filmed inside a room of Wei Pio actually reenacting the crime. Wei Pio admitted striking David on the head with a garden hoe, and he also said that he witnessed Sa Lin hit Hannah 4 times with the same instrument before they threw the garden hoe away. The next day on October 3rd, Thai police took Sa Lin and Wei Pio down to the crime scene on Sairi Beach for a public reconstruction of these murders. Now, I've seen this in other countries like Russia as well. In this case, the handcuffed men wore bulletproof vests and helmets, and they walked among a crowd of officers who were using their arms to protect them from the crowds of people that had gathered around. It's quite the spectacle. So public reconstructions of crimes are very common in places like Thailand, where the accused people or person is required to participate. But for all the people who were standing around and watching this on TV, it actually seemed like these men had no idea what they were doing. It was like that they were being instructed where to move, where to stand. It was kind of unusual. It didn't seem like they were familiar with the layout of the scene and that they were being guided around as they were trying to explain what happened. Now, they also don't know the language. So anyway, it can be very prejudicial when you're sitting there reconstructing a crime scene because you haven't even gone to trial yet. Just keep that in mind. And there were a lot of concerns around whether or not they would receive a fair trial after this. You can see this in the videos that we're putting on screen. For one thing, they didn't use the garden hoe to demonstrate. They actually brought them a dustpan, and that itself almost made this look silly. I mean, it was kind of cheesy with him pretending to play the guitar on a log and then being pushed to different places on the beach. It didn't look natural. It didn't even look like these two boys who looked like boys. I mean, they're young. I mean, they're 22, but they looked very young. It didn't even look like they were bold enough to take control and act this out, let alone actually do something this heinous.
Well, after the DNA samples were obtained from both men, the results were again available within what seems like record time, less than 12 hours. Considering that in Thailand, police conduct forensic testing of evidence in the absence of an independent lab, you'd think that that would mean that the results wouldn't be available so quickly. But investigators announced that the men were an exact match to the DNA found on the cigarette butts and in semen located on Hannah's body. 2 of the DNA profiles matched semen swabbed from her rectum and 1 matched swabs from her vagina. It appeared they had the killers.
They were exact matches. Just keep that in mind that they're using the word exact matches.
By this time, Hannah and David's bodies were returned to their families. David was identified by his father Ian, who had made the heartbreaking journey to Bangkok. Hannah's heartbroken family also made the arduous journey to personally bring their daughter home. In Britain, the Home Office arranged for a second autopsy of Hannah's body. Pathologist Dr. Nat Carey concurred that the young woman died quickly from severe head injuries inflicted by the metal blade of the garden hoe. He agreed that Hannah had been sexually violated and dragged along the sand.
Her family was absolutely shattered, and they released a statement thanking everyone for their support, saying, quote, "As a family, we feel enormous relief to have Hannah back at home where she belongs. She poured joy into the lives of all who knew her. We continue to work closely with officers to assist in the investigation and bring those responsible to justice. Time makes the pain of this horrendous tragedy no easier to bear. The past 3 weeks have been unimaginably difficult, and there are no words that can adequately describe the heartache and despair that our family is experiencing. Our thoughts are with David Miller's family, who are suffering the same indescribable agony. Due to the nature of her passing, our beautiful girl has had little privacy. Our family has been further traumatized by reports that there are numerous unnecessary and senseless photographs circulating across the internet. We beg that Hannah and David are afforded privacy and dignity through the removal of these pointless and insensitive reminders. As a family, we hope that the right people are found and brought to justice.
On October 3rd, a memorial service was held for David at Holy Trinity Church in Jersey, where he grew up. Hymns were sung in his honor, and a rendition of Forever Young by Bob Dylan was played. David's wicker coffin, adorned with sunflowers, was solemnly carried out of the church, bound for a private funeral at another location nearby with his family. The minister who led the service later told the BBC, quote, "David was such a colorful character, a man of life, energy, and vitality. Whilst there is great sadness that someone so young has died, this is a celebration of his life. To give thanks to God for the impact he made. What we will do today and all through the next months is show love. Love to his parents, to his brother, to his friends, and the rest of his family." End quote. The Millers issued a statement themselves expressing their gratitude but requesting privacy, saying, quote, "Our hearts go out to the Witheridge family, who are also coming to terms with the sudden trauma of the equally senseless ending of Hannah's life. Our thoughts are also with any other innocents that have been hurt by harassment or wrongful accusations. We have been overwhelmed by the breadth and depth of support provided to us by so many here in Jersey and also by people far away. We were also particularly touched by the vigil and prayers held by good people on Koh Tao." End quote. The statement went on to say that they had been deeply traumatized by wild and irresponsible speculation of the circumstances surrounding David's death. They said they urge anyone who can help with these investigations to please assist the Royal Thai Police in solving these murders and bringing the culprits to justice, and that they would like to concentrate all their thoughts on their lovely David, who was taken from them before his time and before he could blossom to his full potential. He was very special to them. He brightened up their world, and they said they would miss him terribly.
A week later, on October 10th, 200 of Hannah's friends and family packed the St. Mary Virgin Church in her village of Hemsby to attend what was truly a celebration of life. 50 people who couldn't even fit inside the church on that warm fall day listened to the service outside via speakers. Hannah's parents, Tony and Sue, asked mourners not to wear black, but instead bright colors, much like a wedding, to what they were calling Hannah's party. Locals lined the streets to pay their respects as a white horse-drawn carriage carried Hannah's white coffin, complete with pink and purple floral arrangements, to the church. Hannah's family followed behind with her mom, Sue, and her sisters, Tanya and Laura, all wearing floral head garlands, one of Hannah's trademark accessories. At the service, a video tribute was played to Hannah, along with songs by Ed Sheeran, One Direction, Cyndi Lauper, and John Legend, as Hannah's loved ones reflected on their treasured memories of the young woman. Hannah's father, Tony, and her siblings all gave readings, as Hannah's coffin was led out of the church to the song She's So Lovely by Scouting for Girls. The congregation erupted into applause, and Hannah was buried in the churchyard, with Tony and Sue asking that instead of floral tributes, people actually consider donating to a local animal rescue charity. This was a testament to Hannah's great love of animals, including the beloved horses that she rode in her equestrian events.
If you're wondering how much involvement British law enforcement was able to have in the investigation, the answer is not much. This is because in death penalty cases, the British government does not assign foreign police forces and instead functions as observers. After speaking with a Thai diplomatic official about the lack of communication and transparency on the part of the Thai authorities, a decision was made in late October for UK law enforcement to be permitted to observe the investigation, but not participate in it. Homicide detectives from the Metropolitan Police and a forensic analyst were permitted to enter Koh Tao, but were restricted in what they could do, where they could go, and who they could even speak to.
I kind of feel like this is unfair. I wish they could just take over the case from the beginning, but I also know where you die determines who will take possession of your body. We don't think about that. I mean, we don't choose where it happens most times.
Right, you become part of the government.
Exactly.
And their stint on the island was restricted to a mere 2 hours, during which they were unable to engage with either the accused individuals or their legal representatives. While British law enforcement's findings were not officially published, the team that visited Koh Tao did meet with Hannah and David's families upon their return to the UK.
But they were only there for 2 hours, so what could they have really done?
However, with further investigations, particularly spearheaded by British media outlets, the once pristine image of Koh Tao as a haven of safety and minimal risk for Westerners began to deteriorate.
Remember we told you that there had been deaths happening for years that were unexplained? Well, back in January of 2014, 9 months before David and Hannah were murdered, a 25-year-old Briton named Nick Pearson died while he was on vacation with his parents and his brother. One morning, after a night out with his family, Nick's body was found floating in the bay outside of their hotel. Now, Nick had been suffering from an ankle injury, so his family had to scoop him up the night before at one of the establishments and help him get into bed. So his devastated loved ones had no idea how he was able to get outside and then somehow get all the way to the bottom into this bay. It was obvious to them that Nick hadn't fallen. There was no way he could have been sleepwalking down the 50-foot steep, rocky drop to the water, especially with his ankle in such a bad condition. There was no meaningful investigation into Nick's death. No witnesses were interviewed, and nothing was searched. Foul play was ruled out despite a gash on Nick's head and dried blood on his face, and the cause of death was determined to be drowning. It's so scary to know that your loved one's death won't even be investigated.
It is scary. But let's get back to Hannah and David's case. On October 21st, Zha Lin and Wei Pio met with 2 Myanmar embassy lawyers. They'd also met with the National Human Rights Commission of Thailand. And it was only now that they felt safe enough to actually talk about what really happened. They retracted their confession. The men denied having sex with Hannah and committing the murders, saying that they only confessed because they were threatened and tortured by police. This included being beaten, kicked, punched, sexually violated, threatened with electrocution, and left in a freezing room naked while a group of police officers took photographs of them. Zha Lin even had a plastic bag placed over his head in an attempt to suffocate him, yet they continued to remain silent and take the abuse. Finally, the Thai police told them that in return for confessing, the men would only receive relatively short sentences, such as like a year or 2 in prison. So in order to save their lives and stop the brutal beatings, that's what they needed to do. So they confessed. At no stage during this process were they provided with a lawyer or a fully qualified interpreter. The police instead had a Burmese food vendor fulfill the role, who was of a different ethnic background from the accused men and had a different dialect.
That just seems over the top unfair. And I believe them that they were tortured.
Sure.
Zha Lin and YPO also said that they did not consent to having their DNA collected, and all the documents they signed were in Thai, so they didn't even understand them. And the lawyers that visited with the accused men noted that they appeared to have signs of bruising on their bodies, so there were deep concerns about what they were saying and that it actually might be true. But just wait, because things will begin to emerge. At the same time, prosecutors were having their own troubles. They had an almost 900-page investigation report, and key information that they needed in order to proceed with this prosecution was missing. The entire document needed to be made far more concise, so it was returned to the police so these changes could be made. On November 6, Zha Lin and YPO officially withdrew their confessions on the grounds of duress. The Thai National Human Rights Commission was taking the allegations of torture extremely seriously. But despite their attempts to investigate this further, the Royal Thai Police failed to appear before the commission on 4 separate occasions. And it looked like no further attempts were made to compel them to do so. Investigators, of course, rejected any suggestion that they engage in misconduct. They were adamant that their inquiries were all carried out in accordance with formal protocol. But as the speculation around the integrity of the police investigation intensified, British migrant workers' rights specialist Andy Hall, who actually lived in Thailand at the time, became an advisor for the Myanmar government, and he got involved investigating the treatment of these men. Andy was very skeptical about the integrity of the DNA testing that was conducted on the samples taken from Hannah's body and the cigarette butts at the crime scene. In his mind, The results were returned way too quickly and in the absence of any independent verification that concluded that these two men were contributors. And I can't argue with that because it's very suspicious.
There were also questions about why police had failed to check the CCTV cameras located down near the pier to determine if anyone left the island soon after the slayings. The two men had no money to fund a legal defense and no one to advocate for them. Andy went to visit the accused men, and they repeated what they had told the lawyers from the Myanmar embassy, but still the Thai police weren't budging.
Of course they weren't. They needed this case to be solved.
And Hannah and David's families, on the other hand, expressed support for the investigation, with the Rithridges saying, quote, "There is a great deal of detail in vast areas of investigative work which has been shared with us. We would like to stress that as family, we are confident in the work that has been carried out on these atrocious crimes," end quote. In their own statement, the Millers said, quote, "The support for the Myanmar suspects has been strong and vocal, but please do not jump to any conclusions until you have considered the evidence from both sides in full. From what we have seen, the suspects have a difficult case to answer. The evidence against them appears to be powerful and convincing," end quote.
That surprised me, honestly. The iPhone, though, the location that they were in that night, the fact that they were drinking, their cultural beliefs, yes, they could all point to these two men being the killers. But I never saw any bloody clothing, any DNA reports published. Plus, there was a lot of talk around the island after their arrests, and many people didn't believe it for a second. And information did begin to circulate that there were other theories about what really occurred. The same Reddit poster that I talked about earlier wrote about 3 main theories, and he believed it was probably a combination of all 3 of them in one way or another. To be as brief as possible, because I do think this is very important, he had a friend who was at a party that the 2 accused men were the same night of the murder. And she said that they were accounted for during the time that the murders would have occurred. And she tried to come forward with her own information, but she wasn't taken seriously. That was the first thing. The poster also said that he's very close to the locals who work for very powerful families that are dubbed the mafia. So he's kind of friends with people in the mafia. And they admitted to him in no uncertain terms that the owners of the AC bar had David and Hannah beaten. Whether the intention was to murder them, that's unknown. But it wouldn't be surprising since it's known that people die under very mysterious circumstances. And apparently, meth is a huge issue on the island, but not with the people who come to visit. This is something that happens within the powerful families, and it's hidden very well. And the AC bar is said to be a place to avoid at all costs. There is an unspoken rule that locals never reveal what's going on to tourists. The poster said that he woke up that day around 4:30 to 5:30 a.m. and he made his way to work, and he had to pass where the AC bar was, and he already saw a few people gathering around, and he actually saw Hannah's body laying on the ground. He didn't see David's, and David's was closer to where the water was, so he saw someone that he knew that had ties to the mafia, and of course he asked them what happened. They said they didn't know what happened, but what they did know was that the owner of the AC bar was responsible. The poster went to work that day, and when he got home, his girlfriend repeated the same thing to him, and she got it from a totally different source.
Wow.
I believe it. I believe that
do
there's
too.
sketchy stuff going on.
Absolutely. So the mafia bribed the police force, and remember who allegedly found the bodies?
Or was first alerted. It was the brother of the man who owns the AC bar.
That's right.
Montree Watt.
Plus, he also gets heavily involved in the investigation, right? And it might seem odd that police would take bribes, but they wanted the case to be solved, and they pinned it on this Burmese guy so the Thai reputation didn't go down the drain because their salaries depend on the economy being strong in that area. So that's the same goal the mafia had. So it's speculated that the police have planted fake evidence.
Exactly. Like there's so many ways that they can be corrupt. But you may be wondering, why Hannah and David? There's so many people on this island, so many tourists. Well, here is where the theories come in. Being intimate in public, causing a scene at the AC bar, and money. Those are the 3 theories. To dive a little deeper into this, witnesses say that Hannah and David wanted one last drink at the AC bar right before closing. David allegedly handed over the equivalent of like $25 to $30 for drinks that were only worth about $5 in Thailand. And unlike the US and maybe the UK, you can't expect to get change back. If you pay for something and you pay more than it's priced at, you have to expect to allow the person to keep the change. Remember, they're not in their own country. They had only been on this island a couple days. Well, David had already been drinking, and when he requested his change, the bartender refused since the custom was not to give change back. And of course, David pushed back. But remember, he's known to be the type of person to stick up for himself. But he didn't know that he was confronting someone that was connected to the mafia, who were also heavily involved in using meth. Remember, you aren't supposed to argue back or show any type of violence, or it will be met with the same. Well, this worker, the bartender, relayed this to management, and David and Hannah were followed to the beach after closing by workers who were instructed to beat them up or even kill them. Whether they were observed in the middle of sex or kissing, that's unknown. But it could play into how extreme the violence was if that's what happened on top of the intention to harm them. Please give us your own thoughts on this because, again, these are theories that were going around because of what people were saying who lived there. The poster thinks that this is the closest version to the truth, that the murders were pinned on these two random Burmese guys.
And on December 8th, Zalin and YPO were charged and indicted on 5 counts each: premeditated murder, killing to conceal a criminal offense, forced intercourse, illegally entering Thailand, and staying without permission. Wei Pio was also charged with stealing David's cell phone and sunglasses. Now, if they're convicted, both of these men would face the death penalty. By the summer of 2015, with the trial about to go underway, there had been 2 more mysterious deaths on Koh Tao. In January that year, 29-year-old French tourist Dimitri Pavs was found hanged in his villa with his hands tied behind his back.
Yeah, it would be kind of hard for you to do that to yourself with your hands tied behind your back.
Right, with no chair underneath him.
But also the police just determined that he took his life. No actions were taken after that.
In that same month, 23-year-old British woman Christina Ansley was found dead in her bed at a hotel on Syrie Beach. Christina's family still doesn't know how she died, aside from the fact that she was taking penicillin for a chest infection at the time. But the Thai authorities seem to conclude she passed away as a result of mixing antibiotics with alcohol, though no toxicology report was ever conducted, and research shows that a very small percentage that the combo would have been fatal, like 0.002%.
Right. Penicillin and alcohol. And then she just died.
No witnesses were interviewed in Christina's case, even though they knew the identity of a man seen on CCTV leaving Christina's room around 6 a.m. the next morning she was found dead. It was left to Christina's family to find the man and talk to him to get some answers. But unfortunately, there was nothing much he could tell them.
And that is so sad, but equally sketchy. But now let's go to the trial. Zhao Lin and YPO's trial began on July 8th, 2015, before a panel of judges because there's no jury trials held in Thailand. Both David and Hannah's family were there to see justice done, especially her sister Laura, who had been on the island since September 18th conducting sort of her own interview. She was trying to speak to people and find out what really happened. Zhao Lin and YPO were represented by 2 lawyers from the Lawyers Council of Thailand who were working pro bono. There were different organizations that were allowed to be present, but no one was allowed to take notes, including the media. And that's interesting. So you would have to remember the facts and then post about it later, which would be very hard. The defense was already behind in one major way, because unlike in the US, in Thailand, the defense doesn't automatically have access to all the evidence that the prosecution is going to present. So they can't even prepare an argument. A full brief of evidence is only provided to the defense once the trial starts.
And of course, the prosecution argued that the entire investigation and forensic testing process was sound and conducted to European standards. They said that the DNA didn't lie, and it claimed that the accused men struck David with a hoe multiple times before attacking Hannah, as she lay unconscious on the beach, according to the prosecution. Both men held her down and sexually violated her before using the hoe to bludgeon her to death.
David and Hannah's family found it impossible to stomach having to sit through all the pain and trauma of looking at those pictures of the crime scene. And I think that some of them actually had to walk out, which wouldn't be surprising to me given the nature of how bad they were.
No kidding. Those photos are disgusting.
I know, it's the worst thing I've probably ever seen.
The defense rejected the prosecution's narrative and provided evidence proving that Za Lin was not an undocumented worker. For the 2 years prior to the murders and since his arrival in Thailand, he'd have a valid work permit. And in terms of the night in question, he argued the swimming story was true. The men had just been hanging out, drinking, and swimming before going home. They did admit to taking and concealing the real place that the iPhone was found, but that was out of fear. The defense also brought up that the hair in Hannah's hand was never matched to anyone, and the police pathologist testified that the lab couldn't be sure of the exact color of the hair or who it belonged to. It clearly wasn't from either of these men. Unfortunately, no independent witnesses testified for the defense as to the movements of the accused men that night. Many refused to doing so, fearing the potential repercussions, and so the men's alibis went uncorroborated. The central focus of the defense argument was that the investigators failed to test numerous pieces of evidence recovered from the crime scene. This included Hannah's clothing, blood-stained sand, and blood smeared on the rocks nearby. The fact that the DNA report was only 5 pages long in total and included handwritten notes made the findings questionable from a defense perspective.
Plus, there was also the fact that the report based on Hannah's autopsy was dated 2 days after investigators had already confirmed that the DNA belonged to Za Lin and YPO, not September 17th when the autopsy and testing of Hannah was originally conducted. That's really odd. And the defense had real concerns over the thoroughness of this DNA testing. They asked to have the semen samples retested because they said that law enforcement failed to protect the chain of custody from the very beginning. But this retesting was refused. The defense was told that the semen samples had been used up in their entirety. And one officer even suggested that any remaining samples had already been destroyed. I know, destroyed. Like you wouldn't need... I wonder why. So the defense had a really good expert. It was the director general of the Central Institute of Forensic Science. And she testified that the police examining the crime scene and gathering the physical evidence didn't have any or very little forensic training. She actually did retest what she could, which was the garden hoe. And it was true, David's DNA was present on the murder weapon, but so was 2 other unidentified men who were not Za Lin and YPO. And guess what? Their DNA wasn't on the murder weapon at all. I'm not even going to start to get into how difficult it is when you have mixed samples of DNA. Even using the most cutting-edge technology, the time frame just didn't match up. And nothing in DNA is 100%. Yet that's the way the results were stated, that it was 100% matched to these defendants. This trial went on for 3 months, and it lasted up to 10 hours a day. But it finally adjourned in October for the judges to consider their verdict.
On December 24th, David's family was back in Thailand to hear the outcome. According to the panel of judges who claimed they did not take the confessions into account, the DNA samples recovered from Hannah's body, which the prosecution claimed were an exact match to Za Lin and YPO, were more compelling than the unidentified male profile found on the garden hoe. So Za Lin and YPO were found guilty and sentenced to death.
The young men's mothers who had attended the entire trial were outside just crying uncontrollably when they learned their son's fate. One of them said this is not something her son would be capable of, and she begged and begged for him to be released. But David's brother Michael, on the other hand, he spoke on his family's behalf, and he said, quote, "We believe that the result today represents justice for David and Hannah. David was hacked from behind, dragged into the sea, and left to die. That will live with us forever. What happened to Hannah Witheridge is unspeakable. David always stood up for justice, and justice is what has been delivered today. Our 24 years of memories and his beaming smile will always be cherished. David was intelligent and hardworking. He was caring, inclusive, enthusiastic, and fun. He was irreplaceable to us. Our hearts will always be filled with the brightness he brought to our hearts. We are so proud of him. We and his friends will miss him terribly. We believe that after a difficult start, the Royal Thai Police conducted a methodical and thorough investigation. We've came to realize that the police investigation and the forensic work performed was not the so-called shambles it was made out to be. We respect this court Anna's decision completely. Having listened carefully to all the evidence, and despite what their lawyers say, it is in our opinion that the evidence against Wei Pio and Zhao Lin is absolutely overwhelming. They sexually violated to satisfy their selfish desires, and they murdered to cover up that fact. They have shown no remorse during the trial, end quote. And that surprised me, but they did hear much more than I ever will, so perhaps there were things that I don't understand because I wasn't there that makes these two men guilty. But in the end, I always say if a family's satisfied with a verdict, I tend to let it go. But in my heart, I believe in true justice. And I don't want innocent people being punished when they didn't commit a crime and then the real killer still being out there.
Right. And Hannah's family weren't present to hear the verdict. Instead, they released a statement which contrasted that of the Millers, saying, quote, "The past year has been unimaginably impossible for our family. We have found the trial process extremely difficult, and our trips out to Thailand to attend court made for particularly distressing experiences. We found listening to proceedings very challenging, and we have had to endure a lot of painful and confusing information. We now need time as a family to digest the outcome of the trial and figure out the most appropriate way to tell our story," end quote.
See, and I think that's the way that I've looked at it. There's just so many things and questions that are left unanswered. And Zhao Lin and Wei Pio's families were heartbroken. The Burmese people were so outraged at what they perceived as injustice and discrimination that protests began to erupt. And international human rights organizations expressed their shock and dismay at this outcome, claiming that the convicted men had been framed in the face of a sloppy investigation and insufficient evidence. It was still being speculated that the real killer or killers were members of the wealthy and influential families in the community.
But the international spotlight on the case didn't end there. On January 3rd, 2016, a 40-minute video was posted on the internet by an online group called Anonymous. They accused investigators of making Zhao Lin and Wei Pio scapegoats, condemning the verdict. In Anonymous's trademark style, a masked member of the group in a disguised voice read a statement about how the two Burmese migrants are to be executed, and that it's all a sham to protect Thai's tourism industry. By now, the activists have also hacked Thai government websites, publishing confidential information obtained from law enforcement servers.
What was also interesting is after this video was published, Hannah's sister Laura immediately spoke out against the Thai police. Like the rest of her family, she still had to wake up every day knowing that Hannah was gone, and it was a pain that would never leave them. But Laura made angry posts on Facebook stating that she had received death threats and she'd been a victim of constant trolling for warning people not to go out to Thailand out of fear for their safety. People were sending her the graphic pictures of the crime scene. And Laura also claimed her family had been treated really insensitively by the Thai authorities. And she alleged that there was a high level of corruption involved. This really upset the Thai officials, and they responded by actually saying that they were going to see whether what she was doing was against the law, like that she'd been defaming them. But it doesn't appear that any real action was taken against her. So that is how they treated a victim's family member. And while there was a slight decrease in tourism numbers across Thailand immediately following Hannah and David's murders, the industry soon bounced right back. But sadly, tourists have continued to die on this island under mysterious circumstances. In January of 2016, the body of 26-year-old British man Luke Miller, no relation to David, same last name, was found dead at the Sunset Bar on Sairi Beach. He was floating in the swimming pool. The Thai police once again had a reason for why he died. They said he drowned in the pool after he tried to jump in from the DJ booth. However, Luke's friends maintain that he was savagely beaten and thrown into the pool to die. In April of the following year, the body of 30-year-old Belgian woman Elise Delamenge was found in the jungle. Her remains had been laid out in the open, and she had been partially eaten by native lizards. That is so sad. And when an autopsy was conducted, authorities claimed she hung herself from a tree. But this woman was about to return from her trip. She had traveled all around Southeast Asia for 2 years, and her mom, of course, rejected the conclusion that her daughter had just taken her own life. She was the 7th tourist to die under suspicious circumstances within 3 years of Hannah and David's murder. That is insane.
Zhao Lin and Wei Piao appealed their sentence to the High Court, but in March 2017, this was unsuccessful. So was another appeal to Supreme Court in Thailand in August 2019.
Also, I wanted to bring this up. Tragically, the following month, Hannah's family lost a second daughter when Laura passed away after experiencing ongoing complications resulting from the surgery to treat that condition she was suffering from. Sadly, the 30-year-old had been 9 weeks pregnant when she died. It's so much to take in, and I feel so bad for her family. Then on August 14th, 2020, the King of Thailand issued a royal decree that commuted the death sentences for the two men, Zhao Lin and Wei Piao. Instead, they were sentenced to life in prison. And David Miller's family actually supported this because they were opposed to the death penalty. They said, quote, "We are grateful to His Majesty the King of Thailand for showing his clemency to the murderers of our son David. Every moment we miss our son. Our thoughts are also with the Witheridge family and the tragic loss of their daughter. We hope that these two murderers will now spend a very, very long time in jail where they cannot harm other families and will have time to reflect on the consequences of their act. Today, the 31-year-old Zhao Lin and Wei Piao reside, but they continue to maintain their innocence, and they hope that one day they will be released." There's a lot of controversy over what exactly happened in this case and the entire investigation and the guilt of the two men. There have been so many other suspicious deaths, as we have said, and this case bothered me so badly. I mean, in a lot of cases, we never know what really happened because the killer is not really going to say everything they did. But honestly, I don't know what to think. I'm left with so many different questions, but I'm going to leave it to all of you to analyze everything that we've provided in this very deep dive. So don't forget to give us your thoughts in the comments.
Thank you so much for watching this video and being here for Hannah and David's story.
We will see you in our next video. Bye.
Bye.